July 15, 1976. A perfect summer afternoon in the small, sun-baked town of Chowchilla, California. School was out, and the familiar yellow bus of the Dairyland Union School District was making its final rounds. At the wheel was Frank Edward Ray, a man everyone in town knew and trusted. Ed, as he was called, was a kind, sturdy presence, a farmer who drove the bus to make ends meet. He'd driven this route for 23 years, and today was no different. Or so it seemed. Aboard were 26 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14. They were laughing, chatting, filled with the simple joys of summer vacation, swimming pools, popsicles, and endless days of play. None of them could have imagined that their familiar, dusty ride home was about to detour into one of the most bizarre and terrifying crimes in American history. As the bus rumbled down a quiet country road, a white van suddenly blocked its path. Ed Ray slowed down, annoyed at first, thinking it was just a stalled vehicle. But then, 3 men wearing nylon stockings over their heads emerged, brandishing firearms. The children's laughter froze. The carefree summer afternoon shattered. The Chowchilla Kidnapping had begun. This wasn't a crime born of malice or rage. It was a crime born of greed and a disturbingly elaborate, yet deeply flawed, fantasy. The masterminds were 3 young men from wealthy families in the nearby Atherton area. Frederick Newhall Woods IV, the 24-year-old son of a quarry owner, and his 2 friends, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. They weren't hardened criminals. They were misguided young men who saw a shortcut to riches. Inspired by the film Dirty Harry, they concocted a plan to hijack a school bus, hold the children and driver for a $5 million ransom, and then vanish without a trace. They spent over a year preparing. They scouted locations, acquired weapons, and, most chillingly, prepared a prison for their victims. Using equipment from Fred Woods' family quarry, they bought an old moving van and buried it in a Livermore gravel pit. They reinforced it, installed mattresses, ventilation pipes, and a crude toilet, transforming it into a subterranean tomb. They believed their plan was foolproof. They had thought of everything, except the most important thing, the resilience and ingenuity of their captives. Back on the country road, the armed men stormed the bus. Their faces were distorted, their voices muffled by the stockings. One held a shotgun to Ed Ray's chest, ordering him to open the door. The children, some crying, some frozen in shock, were herded off their familiar bus and into 2 dark, windowless vans. The kidnappers tried to be calm, telling the kids not to worry, that this was just a game. But the darkness, the confinement, and the sight of weapons told a different story. For the next 11 agonizing hours, they were driven through the California countryside. The vans were hot, stuffy, and filled with the sounds of terrified whimpers. No one knew where they were going or what would happen to them. Finally, in the dead of night, the van stopped. The doors swung open, and the children were led, one by one, to a gaping hole in the ground. A ladder descended into blackness. This was their prison, the buried moving van. The kidnappers forced all 27 captives down the ladder. Ed Ray, despite his own terror, tried to keep the children calm, helping the little ones descend into the suffocating darkness. Once everyone was inside, the heavy metal lid slammed shut above them, and 2 massive industrial batteries were placed on top to weigh it down. They were trapped, buried alive. Inside, the conditions were nightmarish. The air was thick and hot, smelling of dirt and fear. The ventilation fans the kidnappers had installed barely worked. The feeble light from a few flashlights cast long, dancing shadows, making the cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. The younger children began to cry uncontrollably. Panic started to set in. The roof above them began to sag under the weight of the dirt. For a moment, it seemed like this underground prison would become their grave. But Ed Ray refused to let them give up. He knew they had to get out, and they had to do it themselves. While the children were fighting for their lives underground, a different kind of chaos was unfolding above. When the school bus failed to complete its route, frantic parents began calling the school, then the police. A massive search was launched. The abandoned bus was found quickly, hidden in a thicket of bamboo. But there were no signs of a struggle, no ransom note, no clue as to where the children and their driver had gone. The news spread like wildfire, gripping not just Chowchilla, but the entire nation. It was every parent's worst nightmare. Law enforcement was baffled. The kidnappers had planned to call in their ransom demand, but their timing was terrible. The Chowchilla Police Department's phone lines were so overwhelmed with calls from media and concerned citizens that the kidnappers couldn't get through. Frustrated and exhausted from their long night, they decided to take a nap before trying again. It was a fatal mistake. Their delay gave their captives a window of opportunity. Down in the buried van, Ed Ray was a beacon of strength. He knew despair was their greatest enemy. He and the oldest boy on the bus, a 14-year-old named Mike Marshall, realized that waiting for a rescue that might never come was not an option. They had to save themselves. They began to look for a way out. Their eyes fell on the metal plate in the roof where the ladder had been. It was their only hope. Ed and Mike started to stack the old, soiled mattresses on top of each other, creating a makeshift platform. Standing precariously on the wobbly stack, they could just reach the lid. They pushed. It was incredibly heavy, weighed down by the dirt and the batteries. 4 hours, they took turns, pushing with all their might. Other older boys joined in, their young muscles straining against the immense weight. The air was getting thinner, the heat more intense. The roof groaned, and dirt trickled in. It was a race against time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of agonizing effort, they felt a slight shift. A sliver of light pierced the darkness. Hope surged through the group. They had moved it. With renewed determination, they kept pushing. Ed Ray used a piece of wood to wedge into the growing gap, giving them leverage. With one final, desperate heave, they pushed the lid open just enough for a person to squeeze through. Mike Marshall, being slender and brave, was the first to climb out. He emerged into the dim twilight of a gravel quarry, unsure of where he was. But he was free. He helped Ed Ray out, and together, they began lifting the children, one by one, from the dark hole into the fresh night air. 16 hours after being buried alive, all 27 captives had escaped. They were exhausted, filthy, and traumatized, but they were alive. They stumbled through the quarry until they found a security guard at a nearby building, who was stunned to see a bus driver and 26 children emerge from the darkness. The guard called the police. The ordeal was over, but the search for the men responsible was just beginning. With the victims safe, the investigation kicked into high gear. Ed Ray and the older children were able to provide surprisingly detailed descriptions of the vans and even partial license plate numbers they had glimpsed. But the most crucial clue came from Ed Ray himself. Under hypnosis, he was able to recall almost the entire license plate of one of the kidnappers' vehicles. This single piece of information was the key that unlocked the case. The plate was traced to a warehouse owned by Fred Woods' family. A search of the property revealed a treasure trove of evidence, a draft of the ransom note, lists of the children's names, and materials used to prepare for the crime. These weren't strangers or hardened criminals from a rough background. They were sons of privilege, from one of the wealthiest communities in the Bay Area. The motive was simple: pathetic greed. They wanted to pull off a perfect crime to fund a life of ease, but their arrogance and sloppy planning led to their downfall. The manhunt was on. Richard Schoenfeld, panicked by the news of the escape, turned himself into authorities just over a week after the kidnapping. His brother James was captured in Menlo Park shortly after. The ringleader, Fred Woods, managed to flee to Canada but was apprehended in Vancouver 6 months later. All 3 men were brought to trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They confessed to the crime, though they showed little remorse, still seeming to view it as a failed business venture rather than a terrifying act of violence against children. Their defense tried to argue that no one was seriously physically injured, a claim that ignored the profound psychological trauma inflicted on the victims. The court disagreed. All 3 were found guilty of kidnapping for ransom and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, due to a later appellate court ruling, their sentences were changed to life with the possibility of parole, a decision that would haunt the victims for decades to come. For the children of Chowchilla and for Ed Ray, the escape was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a lifelong struggle. The world hailed them as heroes, but back home, they were just kids trying to understand the nightmare they had endured. Many suffered from intense post-traumatic stress. They had debilitating nightmares, a profound fear of the dark, of vans, of being left alone. Some developed anxiety disorders and phobias that followed them into adulthood. The carefree innocence of their childhood had been stolen from them in that buried van. The town of Chowchilla rallied around them, but the psychological scars ran deep. Every parole hearing for their kidnappers forced them to relive the trauma, to step back into that dark hole and fight for their safety all over again. Ed Ray, the quiet hero who led them to freedom, was celebrated by the town and the nation. But he, too, carried the weight of that day for the rest of his life. He passed away in 2012, forever remembered as the bus driver who refused to let his kids down. The legal saga of the kidnappers continued for over 40 years. Richard Schoenfeld was the first to be released on parole in 2012, followed by his brother James in 2015. Their release was met with anguish and protest from the victims, who felt that justice had not been served. Frederick Woods, the mastermind, remained in prison the longest. He was denied parole numerous times, in part because he continued to run businesses from behind bars, showing a lack of remorse and a continued focus on financial gain. He even purchased a mansion near the prison. Finally, in 2022, after 46 years in prison, Fred Woods was also granted parole. For the survivors, it was a final, bitter pill. The men who buried them alive were now free. The Chowchilla Kidnapping remains a chilling chapter in American crime history. It's a story of greed and entitlement, but more importantly, it's a powerful testament to human resilience. It reminds us that in the face of unimaginable terror, courage can be found in the most unlikely of heroes, a humble bus driver and a group of schoolchildren who, when faced with darkness, decided to dig their way to the light. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.